So we have looked at the 5 possible topics for the final essay in class. We've talked about them all. Anybody have any questions about them? Okay. So remember, on a separate page linked here are the guidelines for both the research papers. So this has the same guidelines as the first one. We're looking for a full 4 pages of discussion, and it could run up to 6. You're obviously writing on one of the 5 topics that are assigned. Look in your textbook for any useful information that you can include in your essay, and be sure to cite the page number from your textbook with the name of the authors in front of it. If you go beyond the textbook and use some additional resources from the library or the internet, be sure to cite those in your bibliography. And down here is a checklist, which is basically a rubric. This is what I'm looking for in your final essay, so do take a look at the rubric and make sure you have things like an introduction, which states what question you picked from the 5 options in the prompt, and also says what your thesis is going to be, like what you're trying to present in the essay. The body of your essay should have some kind of references to the course material or things that we've discussed. And simply by answering the questions that are in the prompt, it will lead you to those kinds of issues. So whether it's directly from the textbook that you are taking material and citing it, or if it is simply topics that we have discussed that come up as you are writing the essay, that's good. What we want to avoid is something that is disconnected from anything we've discussed in the course or was in the textbook. Be sure to finish up with a conclusion and a bibliography page which says where your information came from, unless it came from the textbook, in which case it's adequate just to, like I said, in the essay itself, just put in the page number and the names of the authors there. That's called APA format. And do please run it through the spell check. So any questions about the research papers now that we're getting on to that? You'll have the weekend, but it's due not Monday, due Tuesday, next December 11th. Questions? Okay. Good. Well, I look forward to reading them. And of course, this last option here regarding children's programming, we started in on the topic because it's related to what we're talking about this week. So probably what we say a little bit later in lecture today will still be relevant to that. So we'll look forward to that. Otherwise, the final exam is scheduled for Tuesday, December 18th. Unfortunately, it starts at 8 a.m., but if you get here a little later, that's okay. It can run through till 10 a.m. And there is a review page up here for this week, and I have activated the Kahoots. So remember, at the end of most Thursday classes, we run through questions that are good rehearsal for what's on the exam. They're in the form of Kahoots, and so these are all playable now. So on class next Tuesday, which will be our last class, we will do a review for the exam. This page is available to you now. These Kahoots could be played anytime as of now until December 18th at 7 a.m. So you can use them to practice. And then there is a list of topics, which if you want to also review through the textbook, this is, sort of the topics addressed by each of the questions on the final exam. So you may want to run through those and see if you feel you've covered all of them. I'm just looking through chapter 13. So these are things that we've mostly discussed last class, and we'll be looking forward to rounding that up at this class. At the end of this class, we'll have a Kahoot about this. But I think we do remember the strong effects theory of media influence, which was the idea that, it was kind of disparagingly eventually called the magic bullet, because it was a little unrealistic. The idea was that people who were exposed to a message would sort of have their, convictions instantly changed by the message. It made no distinctions about different people and the different possible critical reactions to media. And so they called it the magic bullet, because it was like, wow, if you could only take a message and shoot it into someone's brain and they would believe what you wanted them to believe, sort of the dream of propagandists. And that's why this strong media effect theory appeared at the time that it did, because media theorists researchers were worried about the potential for propaganda to take over people's minds. We finished up last class talking about a very interesting theory called cultivation theory, with a kind of a looser term being the mean world syndrome. And so that was very interesting and successful research from a researcher at Stanford who spent several decades working on this issue of the effects of violence in media. His name was George Gerbner. He's still alive, but he's retired. And Gerbner said, well, we're looking for the wrong thing. We're looking for something we can never prove, which is a direct correlation between people watching violent media and people committing acts of violence. And he said, well, it's very complex, and we'll never be able to sift through the influence of the media and separate it out from the influence of other aspects of personality, of socialization, of unhappy childhood, of chemical imbalances, and so on and so forth. But Gerbner said, well, we can see the influence of violence on television affecting society in a more subtle way, what he called the mean world syndrome. Through doing extensive research on the content of the media, tabulating just how many violent acts television viewers are exposed to on a day-by-day basis, and then also comparing that to research done on the attitudes of television watchers, Gerbner was able to demonstrate that the more TV you watch, the more you think you're likely to be a victim of violence in society. And one of the neat things about this theory is that the perception that heavy television watchers have, that they live in a mean world, is actually contradicted by the social data that we have, which is that violent acts as a whole, on a nationwide basis, have been going down for several decades, even as people's perception of how scary the world is has been getting worse. And the more you watch TV, in his research, the more the people that were studied watched TV, the more they believed that the world was mean, so that they could be victims of violence. So as you see, maybe we thought we could get somewhere by looking for a direct correlation between violent media and violent acts. Wasn't very successful. But Gerbner's approach to say, well, the violence pervades people's perception of the world, that does have plenty of proof based on what he did. So very, very interesting research there. As far as the strong effects of violence on media watchers is concerned, some early experiments, the Bobo doll experiment, which was designed to prove a theory that television watchers or media consumers in general will model the behavior that they see on TV, that they will they will see something happen on TV and act out on it themselves, which is the basis of the assumption that the kind of hypothesis was that if someone watches something violent, will they commit violence? Well, the Bobo doll experiment was bringing in samples of kids, showing them video of other kids beating up a Bobo doll, like a sort of plastic inflatable clown that you punch and it bounces back up, and then letting the kids go into a controlled lab room and say, well, your mom will be in just a second, and there's a Bobo doll in the corner, and observing what happens. And the kids who saw the videos of other kids beating up Bobo dolls would much more often go and beat up the Bobo doll just to pass some time while they were waiting for their moms. The kids who hadn't seen those videos would sort of sit around and not do it. So it gave some credence to the idea that media gives us models for behavior, but beyond that, to pursue it out into a study, for instance, of people playing first-person shooter games and then going out and shooting people in real life, that has not, borne out the modeling theory itself. So there may be other kind of restraints. I hope there are restraints on people's behavior that come into play there. So that's pretty much where we got to. Last class, we also talked about selective processes. So here was the idea that once people became a little bit skeptical about the magical bullet theory, the idea that you just see the message and you're convinced, researchers began thinking of other models which would take into account the selectivity of different individuals. So our ability to selectively respond to media. And so in this case, the model suggests that, and there was proof, corroboration, that depending on your initial assumptions, what you already believe, you will selectively expose yourself to media. So if you're a conservative, you'll watch Fox News. It pleases you because you hear more conservative points of view. You'll avoid, all the other media probably, where you probably believe that you're not seeing reality. There's selective perception, which is that based on your prior cognition, your what you believe about the world, when you see something and you have to interpret what's going on, you will perceive the things that you believe in better than others. And selective retention is the idea that if we test you afterwards, show you a documentary where there are, let's say maybe liberals and conservatives in that documentary, and then test you on what you remember afterwards, you will remember better stuff that you believed in already. You'll be less able to account for points of view that you didn't hold. So that's the idea of selective processes: selective exposure, selective perception, selective retention. And they called these limited effects because compared to the strong effects, which was the initial assumption, media just strikes you and you believe, this type of model suggests, well, the media can convince you of stuff, but really it works best when you already believe things and the media just reinforces it. And I guess the sort of discouraging aspect of this is that it's much harder to change people's minds about anything. So there you go. So we should also talk today about indecent content and pro-social viewing and gatekeeping theory. So let's jump in there and catch up with that on these slides. And then we can have a Kahoot later on to see what we think. Another line of research and policy making and even lawmaking on behalf of the government has been based on the idea that some kinds of content is dangerous for at least part of the audience. Kids, of course, have been a focus here because it's pretty obvious that kids are not ready for certain types of content until they reach a certain age. And a countervailing principle, in our country at least, is the idea that the government should not limit an individual's speech. So these two ideas have been in tension. We can't just have unfettered freedom of speech, because some speech, or by speech we mean just communication. So television would be a form of speech too. So some speech is potentially harmful to some audiences. So we do have a reason to restrain some kinds of speech. And while violence is pervasive on television, as we have seen in our previous topic that we just talked about, obscenity in other forms of offensive or indecent content have been addressed and are limited in different ways depending on the electronic medium. So the strongest protections, or if you view it in a different way, the strongest interventions or limits on free speech have been in broadcast television. And that was based on the notion, right back at the creation of the FCC in the 1930s. The idea was that, well, we've got radio, we've got electronic media. They use the public airwaves. In other words, the radio spectrum is, in the minds of Congress then and now, part of a national heritage, part of our property as the people of the United States. And so that public good is controlled on behalf of the people by their government. And so the airwaves, the radio and television frequency spectrum, therefore is legitimately controlled by the government, and they created the FCC for that. The FCC has, as part of its mandate, controlling content on behalf of the public. You don't want to have to be exposed to offensive content. Just like you wouldn't want to have, somebody come and stand outside your house and scream obscenities on the corner all day long. It would really kind of disturb you, and you would feel, yeah, sure, the police should come along and take that individual away, so that And similarly, there are content controls on offensive content. Based on that idea. You don't want to just turn on this television, which is, and get lots of offensive content coming at you. And so they have treated indecency separate from obscenity based on the tension between the need to control content and the First Amendment rights that we have to not have our speech unduly limited by the government. And this only applies to broadcasting. On cable, the FCC does not regulate content. On the internet, the FCC does not regulate content. Because there the idea is, well, you pay for that. You subscribe to an internet provider, or you subscribe to a cable company. So that's your choice. If you don't want that in your living room, then unsubscribe. But broadcast television over the air uses the public airwaves, and so they do limit that. So as regards indecency right now, if you're a television network, you have what's called a safe harbor. Between the hours of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., you're not allowed to broadcast indecent content. But from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., this is called safe harbor. And that means that you can broadcast indecent content. So it would include cuss words and limited nudity. You're not allowed to show butts, for instance. So nothing that would excite what they call the prurient interests of the population. But you can show racier content after 10 p.m. The idea being there that they wanted a trade-off between protecting the public, but also protecting freedom of speech. So the idea is that, we'll allow you to have racier content, racier speech after 10 p.m. So that's the safe harbor idea. Obscenity is a more complex thing, but there is no safe harbor for obscene content. You're not allowed to put it on the airwaves at all. So the obscenity test is something that has been defined over time, and it has gone back and forth with the Supreme Court and the individual states in the United States. Basically evolving a definition where the states have a lot of say over what standard is actually used to determine if something is obscene. This is pretty straightforward. Obscene material depicts sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. So seeing people commit sexual acts, definitely obscene, So this conforms to our understanding of pornography. Where the state comes into it is in this part of the test, where it says the average person, in taking account of contemporary community standards, so it's kind of all written backwards compared to the actual language. But, when a challenge to some content is taken to court and a jury has to decide on whether this is obscene or not, they're looking at the piece and they're saying, okay, does this piece appeal to prurient interests? In other words, does it hold itself out there as to be something that should attract your sexual interest, get you sexually excited? Based on contemporary community standards, would an average person respond to it in that way? Okay. So this raises a question, well, which community, right? It's like there are some communities that are very tolerant and liberal and open to, various forms of expression, and there are others elsewhere that are, really against it. Think of the, very religious right in some states. Well, those community standards would be much more restrictive than a San Francisco Bay Area sampling, right? So that is why the Supreme Court, which is obviously a national judicial body, said, well, let's let the states decide what are their community standards. So this took a while, and this is actually the Miller versus California decision, which spurred, that advance in this definition of how to treat obscenity. And so that's why nowadays, Miller versus California is a key precedent in terms of restricting obscene content. So basically, unless the work has some literary, artistic, or political or scientific value, then if the state decides to bring a charge against a broadcaster or even an internet pornography outfit or something, the state brings it to the court, and a jury has to decide based on their community standards whether this has no other value except to kind of excite, or get the prurient interest, the sexual interest of the viewer. So that's where we stand now on obscenity, and it is not allowed on broadcast television at any time, versus indecency, which is rather more regarding people who talk about sex, or who talk about poop, or who use, famously there are seven words that you cannot say on TV, which was incredibly enough our most clear list of things that definitely are indecent on television or on radio was defined in a court case against George Carlin, who was a stand-up comic who had a bit about what you can't say on TV. And Carlin came up with 7 filthy words and put them in a comedy album. And the comedy album was played over the radio sort of midday, so it wasn't protected by safe harbor, right? And somebody complained about 3 months later to the FCC, and they looked at the case and they said, yep, George Carlin said the F word, the B word, and a whole, all 7 words. He said them, and you broadcast them, so we're going to fine you, and a very large fine. So this still comes up in terms of broadcasting songs, or the famous the famous wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl, Janet Jackson, sorry. And also, I'm thinking of another one. There was an instance where I think Bono let fly with an F-bomb when they won a Grammy or something. He said, "Holy F, this is great. We got this Grammy," and that wasn't bleeped. And so all of those things came together around early 2000 to sort of bring up, this issue again of indecent content. And it again went to the Supreme Court. Fox and ABC and CBS, I think, were the 3. They went together to the Supreme Court to say, hey, community standards have changed. Society is different. Someone could say the F word as an indication of how happy they are, about winning a prize or something. But the Supreme Court upheld the FCC's right to fine the broadcasters, but they kind of hedged a bit, and they said, in this case, we want the broadcasters and the state governments to go back and define better than just Carlin's 7 filthy words, what it is you can say and can't say. And so they're still working on that. But guaranteed, whenever the FCC does fine a broadcaster for indecency, the broadcaster will come back and challenge that and say, hey, you're infringing on our right to free speech. The world has changed. We can show stuff that everyone tolerates now a lot more than they did in 1970 when Carlin was around. So this stuff is still going on. Okay. We talked about let's see here, media content. So again, research has been done on, again, profanity. Look at that data point. So that's a well-researched demonstration of what we were just talking about in terms of government and the FCC trying to restrict language on broadcast television. Check it out. So this kind of research, very carefully, they record television shows on all networks, and people are employed to go through and basically count the instances of cuss words, count the number of violent acts, and so on and so forth. So this is the type of thing that Gerbner's graduate students did at Stanford for years for the TV Violence Project. There are other organizations that do this, obviously for profanity and indecent content. There is also an organization named GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, which monitors representation of homosexuality on television as well. So there's a lot of different organizations involved in researching the content and stuff. But check it out. On broadcast prime time, 9.8 curse words versus 15.37 on cable. Be interesting to know exactly how they define a curse word. It's definitely not F-bombs and others, but I think you can get away with more on cable than you can on network TV. It's pretty clear. Cursing on broadcast has increased as community standards change. So there we go. It's kind of evidence of liberalizing of content. Let's see here. Just trying to see here. A bit further here. Okay, there's so much on these slides. I just want to hit the stuff which is pertinent to what we'll be studying for the exam. So definitely on the exam is a question about something called agenda setting. So in an attempt to account for the media's power in terms of presenting subjects to us, this is all, again, a continuation of the idea where we really began with powerful effects, that when we saw media messages, they would instantly change our minds. And steadily we have rolled back that idea and explored more of how complicated all this issue is of media influence. One reliable thing that we can say about media is that mass media especially have been able to control to us what we see and what we understand as important in the world. So in the heyday of mass media, when the news that we got simply through newspapers or television, the mass media had this function they call gatekeeping. The idea that only certain facts and information will be allowed through the gate into the public airwaves. So the result is they focus attention and concerns on particular issues and not on other issues. So now that we've got fewer and fewer owners of media, and they, due to consolidation, there are kind of less gatekeepers out there. But on the other hand, since we've got, this whole issue of news being disseminated through social media and people no longer getting their news necessarily through the mass media, through television or radio, but instead getting their news through, the very fragmented and informal channels of social media. In a large part of the population gets their news and information without any reliable gatekeeping. So there's two sides to this issue. On the one hand, mass media is becoming more and more kind of uniform in its presentation of what we should attend to, what we should care about. On the other hand, people are less tied to mass media to make those determinations, and they are more exposed to a whole range of different viewpoints through social media. And of course, that's notoriously now where we can get fake news and where standards are difficult to come by. So gatekeeping and agenda setting are important concepts that come out of this set of ideas. Do you guys think, would it be preferable for a kind of gatekeeping to go on, even over social media, or is it a good thing to kind of open the floodgates and let the citizens decide what kind of information they feel is valid? Yeah?
I believe that it's best for people to decide what they want to read. Because if it's limited, I feel like people won't have as much access to information that they really want to know more about. But it is sort of like it has to be a balance of things, because I think within having a lot of information just being out there, you could get things that are not fact.
Yeah, yeah.
It could be more of opinions and biased. But it's best to just know what's out there than to just be limited on things that people want you to just know, like limit you on things.
Got it.
But there has to be a balance in knowing what's true and what's not true.
Yeah, yeah. So your argument is more kind of libertarian. Let all the information out, but people have to be discriminating and understand what they're reading, and they're responsible for.
Yeah, I feel like and then I feel like also like if you're reading something that makes you uncomfortable, like you have the power to just shut it down. Like you could just be like, okay, I don't want to read this anymore, instead of letting that fill you in with some type of rage, or like feeling like, oh, just like having really bad thoughts about it, where you can just shut it down. Like you don't have to fill your brain with that.
That's interesting. So that reminds me of the selective perception idea that we were just talking about. The notion that, if it's bugging you, you can tune it out. In fact, people do tune it out. On the other hand, if you get caught in a loop of, confirming your rage, whatever it is that bugs you, that's kind of my vision sometimes when I see really conservative media. It's so against the way that I typically think that I don't get on board with it. But then I look at it and I just think, man, if you read this day after day the same thing, you're going to get, really entrenched in this cycle, and you're going to see it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it is also sort of, when it comes to younger kids, it could be a little bit dangerous too, because I feel like some articles / topics aren't really meant for younger kids. I do think there should be a limit towards younger kids.
Yeah.
To an extent.
Right.
I just don't think like little kids should be watching certain things or reading about certain things.
Yeah.
There's an age for it. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. Do other people feel that way? I mean, yeah, Max?
I mean, I think I completely agree. I think that, especially with younger kids, even things that are targeted towards younger kids are becoming so much more extreme on the internet, like on YouTube. A person that comes to mind would be someone like Jake Paul, a YouTuber who basically posts just a bunch of videos of doing like ridiculous, illegal, and very dangerous pranks. And it's targeted towards kids younger than 10.
Okay.
And I feel like that could be a learned behavior that can be dangerous.
Yeah, so you wouldn't want modeling to kick in there, and I think as parents, everyone's looking for some kind of support or defense against the unrestricted flow of, all kinds of information, whether it's your kid happening on pornography online or, the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is probably, well, again, it just seems like in the days when we had a mass media full of gatekeepers, there was more control over this than there isn't now. So, good point. We're all kind of required to, do our own critical thinking nowadays. And good point too that we still need some forms of protection in place over content which could, give kids. I mean, honestly, I look at if a kid's first understanding or representation of sex is going to be what they stumble on, on porn sites online, it's really not going to be a good thing. So, and yet that is a distinct possibility. We got Net Nanny and it really sucks. It's useless. So, it's a very difficult situation.
Okay.
Yeah?
I do want to point out that now I do see more, I wouldn't say restriction, but more, for example, like YouTube now has YouTube Kids, where it's like it's more directed towards kids, and Netflix has like kids show, like they have like a specific like where it says who's watching, it says it's a kid, like
so
who's watching.
Content is
so
selected.
there has to an extent been some limitations towards what kids watch, but you know, kids also know how to use the internet more now.
True,
So.
absolutely, more than us. You know, and there's something also just without being a genius, but if you spend 8 hours a day working with a medium or something with no one overseeing what you're doing, you're going to find the ins and outs in a way that an adult who's got 15 minutes to think about it is never going to find. So yeah, it's a big deal right now, you know, but it's kind of real anecdotal because, you know, I think the more you have kids or the more you're thinking about how kids are going to be affected by this, the more it becomes a real concern. I just wanted to get over to this notion of pro-social, and where would that be again? I think this is what we were just talking about, but let's see here. Just see here. I go to. Just wanted to search the content here just to find. This is terrible. I really have to wean these slides down. There's just too much in them. Let me explain the concept of pro-social then without just being on the slide. But, you know, it's the idea that we all know what something that is antisocial or some person that is antisocial is. You know, we think of it as someone who doesn't want to socialize, or in more general, it would be something that would have a negative effect on society. You know, so being antisocial would be you're not promoting the good of social interaction. Pro-social, on the other hand, is the opposite of that, anti-pro. So pro-social is the idea that something could be good for society, good for socialization. And in this case, the concept comes up in relation to kids and the influence that different programming can have on kids. And so much of policy and research has been dedicated to the idea that, yes, we've got to protect kids. What are the harmful aspects of communication, electronic communication, that we must protect children from? But there's also the other side of the coin, which is that plenty of media content is actually very, you know, constructive for kids. It's pro-social. It has pro-social effects. It helps kids, you know, modeling doesn't have to be beating up a Bobo doll. You know, modeling can be being kind to your friends. You know, Sesame Street for generations helped kids learn, you know, what the letters are, how to count, and so on and so forth. And those are just, you know, very easy examples of pro-social aspects of media, you know. So one of the possible research paper topics is exactly that. I mean, I know I pitched this last class, but here it is again. So it says your text suggests that the bulk of pro-social programming appears on PBS, which is, you know, where Sesame Street was and where a lot of kids shows are, and it's kind of like a brand where, you know, maybe the Disney brand is a promise to parents that their kids are going to see something sort of wholesome and aspirational. The PBS brand would add to that, I think. You know, it's going to be educational as well. But here the prompt says, you know, given now there's children's programming all over the place, you know, 24-hour cartoon channels and so on and so forth on cable channels and internet, you know, on YouTube and stuff, maybe that assumption that you could only learn something or only have pro-social effects by watching public TV is, you know, that's outdated. So if you're interested in writing your research paper about this, it would be, you know, to look at what's currently available to kids on a variety of stations or over cable or on YouTube, Hulu, or on Netflix and such. You know, do you see some kids programming on those other channels, broadly considered, that you teach good and interesting things to kids, either educating them or helping them understand relationships, think constructively about stuff, think positively about themselves. That's another huge thing. It really just invites you to argue against that sort of basic common sense idea that educational stuff, go to public TV, but maybe there's more pro-social stuff available all over the place now. So that might be an interesting thing to work on, especially if you do spend some time watching TV or Netflix with kids. You're probably aware of some of these shows. People have written about Steven Universe in the past. Anybody watch that?
Oh, that's such a good show.
Yeah. It has a lot there in terms of gender and kindness and stuff. It's an interesting show.
Oh, that's an amazing show. Cartoon, actually.
Yeah.
Amazing. I love that show. Cartoon.
Cool. Okay. And we touched on this question: are the viewers of the media responsible for the content that comes into the home? So again, there was, in terms of just this big question of protecting kids from different types of content, in an earlier generation there was a V-chip, which was Congress required television manufacturers to put a control into the television, which could monitor a kind of a warning system from a broadcaster who would say, whoops, this kind of content is rated R, and we, with the V-chip activated, the TV actually won't even show it to your kids, and so that raised a debate which has echoes today. We just saw it in class, which is like, are people not capable of doing their own curation and police work regarding content, or should we have the government actually put in a device like that? Basically the government could require Apple and Google to put way more restrictive technology into their operating systems. Instead, we've let the manufacturers do it themselves, and Apple has responded in the last couple of iterations of the telephone operating system to give parents more parental controls, for instance. And people were basically begging for it. A couple of years ago, the California educators just banded together and said, please, give us some content tools to help parents, because they're crying out for them. So, good Lord, all of this stuff. Okay, I think though that let's just whoops, get out of here. Forgive me, I'm just looking for. There's kinds of topics that there's the final exam review. I just want to make sure that we have an adequate time to discuss whatever is on. So we need to talk about uses and gratifications, but we're clear about gatekeeping theory. We've talked about indecent content, which is, where the assumption is that it can have powerful effect on some viewers. Pro-social viewing, we just looked at it. So, looking at content that might actually have a positive effect, it's not all negative. So uses and gratifications theory. We should find the slide on that, definitely. So here we go. So this is actually this type of research makes assumptions about viewers that are more, they take more account of our own agency, our own ability to decide what we watch and to go out and seek content. So again, by contrast with the powerful effects of the magic bullet, where the image is like, we're a viewer, boom, the propaganda goes right into our brain and we become, basically dominated by those media. Uses and gratifications has a different idea. It's kind of like the media sets out a table of content for us, and we browse and graze and choose what we want based on how useful it is to us and how gratified we are by using it. So this whole paradigm is called uses and gratifications, looking into how audiences actually use media. So it posits like a long list of things that people go to the media, wishes that they have that are gratified by the media. And you know, it kind of follows on with the idea that for kids, some media has pro-social effects. You know, in uses and gratifications, we assume that the audience is in control and they can choose what media content they want. And they often go to media with, you know, with a purpose in mind. So if you think back to our very first assignment where we, you know, I asked you, you know, what do you do with media over, and you know, people were responding, well, you know, I like to, you know, get myself pumped up for going to work by listening to, you know, some exciting, fun music. Or I like to wind down at the end of the day by, you know, watching some mindless reality show or something like that. And so, I mean, everybody has their own gratifications, their own uses for media. So literally there are hundreds of categories that have been, you know, thought up and put into lists so that, you know, and thankfully our slides don't have those specifics, but, you know, the choices, we would have lists of the needs, the values, the other factors that bring people to television viewing, you know. So the need to be informed, the need to be entertained, the need to, you know, be relaxed, the need to be stimulated, and so on and so forth. There are many needs that would come into it. You know. This also breaks out media use into two broad categories, and we've studied these before, but these come back again. The idea that you can go to media with a ritualistic type of approach, which is like, you know, every Monday, me and my dad sit down and we watch the game and we enjoy it together, you know, or you know, at dinner, the whole family turns on the news and we try to discuss what we're seeing there so that our kids are forced to learn something about the world or something like that. So there's a ritualistic aspect of sitting down and just consuming. And then there's an instrumental aspect, which is, you know, I really need to learn about, you know, I don't know, genetic modifications. Where are we at with that? And I'm going to seek out that kind of material on YouTube or something like that. So I have a very clear reason I'm after something instrumental. So that's those ideas there about uses and gratifications. So, you know, this is a real different type of assumption about a viewer than we get with the magic bullet, which is like you're going to be a victim. You're not going to be able to avoid this persuasion. Versus in this, it's the complete opposite. You know, you're in control and you're using media for what you want. So this is quite appealing to us because that's how we perceive what we're doing with media. But something like the mean world syndrome, which suggests that the effect of media is so subtle we don't really monitor it. So that's a different one. Okay, I think those are the broad categories that we wanted to talk about. Definitely.
When you speak about that, are you basically saying we're conditioned to just sort of bypass things that make us uncomfortable, but we've just been so used to them that we don't get uncomfortable by them anymore?
I think, I mean, that's part of, it's on the same level of what Gerbner was talking about with Mean World, which was basically when they studied people who watched a lot of TV and then asked them about the world, you know, when you go out at night, are you afraid of being, you know, attacked? Or, you know, if someone says something to you, like would you respond, or do you think it's too dangerous and such? So they give those kinds of surveys to a lot of people, and they also ask questions like, how much do you watch TV? When they put it all together, they find that the people who watch more TV think that the world is much more dangerous than those who don't watch TV, who have a much more kind of optimistic view about violence and what's going to happen to them. So the conclusion there is that the more TV you watch, the more you think everyday life is dangerous and risky. So that is, in a sense, a kind of a conditioning, that you're talking about. It's like, it is through being exposed over and over again every night to, seeing stories about the world, and they always have violent acts in them. People are conditioned by TV to think that the world is more violent than it actually is.
And would that be correlated to this? Would that idea also be correlated to video games with young kids?
Well, again, yeah. It would again be, the fear there is that, let's say if you tested all, this would be a hypothesis, right? We could be media researchers, and we could say, let's test and see if, kids who watch a lot of games think that the correct way to solve a dispute, for instance, would be like to push each other and shout or something like that, versus the other kids, and test and see if there are, again, that type of assumptions is coming through.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff is, it's easier to make those kind of indirect correlations versus, does the kid who plays a lot of video games wind up getting in a lot of fights at school? Because that actually doesn't work out.
Yeah.
So, but it's all real interesting questions, and all of this is just still being researched by, by scientists all over the world, basically. So, okay. Well, let's try the Kahoot and see, because the Kahoot is good rehearsal for what's on the exam. And also, it's good for me to see, excuse me, if we've covered everything necessary to cover from this vast set of research that is out there. So I did also tell everybody that the final exam review that I've kind of been playing off of, the Kahoots that we've been playing at the end of class are available to you now as what they call challenges. So you can play these on your device. If you need another way to study for this because you don't have a device, then just talk to me and we'll find an alternative. So anyway, we're on Kahoots, and this was chapter 13, and we want to see, where is chapter 13? Here it is. So let's play this one, classic, and obviously participation is voluntary, but I'll just give you time to get in there. Do we have music? Oh, and while we're just dropping in there, just a reminder that in addition to the final essay that we've talked about, there is still one more extra credit possibility. So remember, you can only make a maximum of 100 points out of 500 out of extra credit. However, there is this one is the last one that's still open until next Tuesday. So again, I won't confuse things by going in there and discussing the prompt with you. I want you guys do the official research paper number 2 for next Tuesday, but just a heads up that there is extra credit there that you can use if you want. And so we got a few people joining us. Thank you for that. And I love to participate now myself. Okay, let us start. All right, some believe the government should regulate media content. Others believe that viewers should. So we kind of discussed that. So is that true or false? Let's see, yeah, everyone got it right, true. So yep, there is a healthy debate as to whether government should get involved and regulate or whether viewers could take care of it themselves. And of course that debate also includes device manufacturers like smartphone designers or television designers. So it's been a big question. Number 2, some content not intended for children may be broadcast without penalty during what they called the safe harbor. True or false? And there we go. Everybody got that one right too. Well, this will be good for your final grade. This is encouraging. Yeah, so safe harbor, remember, is kind of a trade-off that the government decided. It's like, okay, we don't want to restrict people's speech unduly, but we do want to protect parents from, just looking at stuff on TV with their kids and all of a sudden there's something really offensive coming through. So we'll say that after 10 p.m., you're on your own. At that point, there's greater leeway for offensive content. So next one, pro-social media effects have positive results, like kids getting higher academic achievement after they've, for instance, watched educational TV or something like that. Is that true or false? Oh, okay, well, it was true. Here's the idea that, if kids start their lives out watching Sesame Street and learning how to count and maybe even learning, a little math early on in life, that they actually do better at school, which is, proven. So that is one of the specific pro-social outcomes that is proven. So that was true, that answer. Okay. Obscenity restrictions in broadcasting are rooted in the Miller v. California court decision. True or false? Okay, we did pretty well on that, so it is true again. So Miller was a pornographer. California took him to trial, said, hey, you're distributing obscene material. And Miller challenged it all the way up to the Supreme Court, which said, well, California, you have to be more clear in your definition of what obscenity is. So right now, the states do make those determinations regarding obscenity, and that was the outcome of that was part of the Miller v. California decision. Okay, which of these is most closely related to Albert Bandura's Bobo doll? So remember the Bobo doll thing we were talking about? Is that research that was looking into offensive lyrics or uses and gratifications or powerful media effects or modeling behavior? Okay, whoa, that one answered before we all had a chance to answer, but majority got it. So the Bobo doll was modeling behavior. So remember, they showed a bunch of videos of kids beating up Bobo dolls and then turned kids loose with a Bobo doll in the corner of the room, and they looked to see if the kids beat up their own Bobo doll. And the conclusion was that, yeah, they were modeling the behavior they had seen in those videos. So it is modeling. Which of these is most closely related to the belief that media have limited effects? Limited effects. The Great American Values Test, which has nothing to do with anything, but it sounded good. Modeling behavior, which we just talked about. The two-step flow, or the magic bullet theory. Boom, where the message just blasts its way into your brain. So which one would you guys choose? Okay, well, majority got it, but here's a good opportunity to review that. So the answer was the two-step flow from a media researcher named Lazarsfeld. And let me just sketch out what those two steps were. Okay, so first of all, our most basic model was the magic bullet. So you had a sender, and they shot a message like a magic bullet into the brain of the receiver, and you had a 100% success rate. That was fantastic as a model, but of course we know it doesn't happen that way in real life. A lot of us are exposed to messages all the time, and they have no effect on us. So the magic bullet is, a very simplistic model that is, what they called that's a very strong effect, right? So this was a strong media effect. But when we talk about limited effects, this is research that was done later. They said, well, this doesn't really conform to reality. Here's another model, what we call the two-step flow. So we had a sender, and we did have actually a bunch of receivers, but in the middle of it, they had what they called an opinion leader. The sender would send a message to the opinion leader. The opinion leader would discuss it and further communicate it to the receiver. And this actually, gave us a much better success rate in terms of, when the message is communicated to the receiver by a trusted intermediary, an opinion leader, there's a much higher chance that influence is going to happen than if you simply, put the message out through the mass media and go this way. So this way you might have a 50% chance of persuading people. This way you might have a 75% chance because of the, the opinion leader's influence, basically. And as we discussed last class, I find this a very interesting model for social media where, you may be not influenced at all by what kind of breakfast cereal Kellogg's advertises on television. But if your friend says, man, I tried this most amazing cereal, should check it out on social media, it's much more likely that you'll give credit to that recommendation than the direct kind of mass media effect. So I think the two-step flow still has a lot of interest in it. Okay, so cultivation, this is another type of research. Cultivation is an example of what type of media effect? Was cultivation analysis. That was the mean world syndrome, remember? Is that a quantitative effect? Like, are we counting stuff up? Is it an emotional effect? Or is it a cognitive effect or a behavioral effect? So we should define those a little better. Quite possible. Well, good. Again, the majority got this, but let's explain a little more. So a cognitive effect means that it is an effect that has an influence on your cognition, on how you think about and perceive the world. So that is what the cultivation analysis is looking at. Basically, if there's a lot of violence on TV, it asks, okay, what's the effect? Does that affect how we perceive the world? It definitely does. We think the world is a meaner place because of it. If it was looking at behavioral effects, it would be, for instance, monitoring heart rate to see if your heart pumps faster when you see an exciting scene on television, or if you run out and buy that product the minute that you see it advertised. That's a behavioral effect. An emotional effect, do you start to cry when you see it, etc. A quantitative effect, is it something that we count? But no, in this case, cultivation is, we're thinking about how it affects the way people see the world, how they think about stuff. All right, next one. Which theory says that people who view a lot of television view the world as a mean place? Oh, we just gave it away. So do you remember what it was in the last question? Is it the inhibition theory, the imitation, the catharsis, or the cultivation theory? Go. And yep, hey, everybody got it just right. So that's the mean world is cultivation theory. Okay, cool. Good job, guys. The ability of news media to focus our attention and concern on certain issues is known as biasing, agenda setting, spamming, or disinhibition. So there is only one of those concepts that we have discussed today. So that should help. Okay, majority got it. The answer is agenda setting. So we didn't talk about bias today, so try to stick to the stuff that we've actually been studying here. But agenda setting is the ability of the mass media in order to tell us what's important. What should we focus on? So think about the news. The news, the nightly news broadcast says, today, the president once again denied that the Saudi Arabians actually chopped up somebody they didn't like in a consulate. They keep focusing us on those particular stories. That is clearly agenda setting. They tell us, yeah, this is what you should be talking about. Which perspective assumes that the individual selects media and content with specific purposes? Is it modeling theory? Is it uses and gratifications theory? Is it the magic bullet? Or is it the two-step flow? So this suggests that we're in control, that we go out and pick media content with a purpose in mind. And what would that be? Yep, okay, a clear majority got it. It's uses and gratifications. So this is the idea that individuals go choose the media they want because they want something from it. So that's good. All right, and last question. Tendency to remember messages that have the most meaning for us is most closely associated with which of these concepts? Selective exposure, selective acceptance, selective retention, selective perception. So let's look at the question again. Tendency to remember messages that have the most meaning for us is most closely associated with. So it asks the tendency to remember messages. And there we go. Once again, the majority got it. So it is selective retention. It's the idea that after exposure, we retain this. We remember the messages. Okay, great. Thanks. I'm encouraged by those results. So next Tuesday, we will do our exam review, more Kahoots. Remember, if you want to study this weekend, the Kahoots are already available to you through the final exam review page on Canvas. Have a good weekend.